I can't stand my stepfather, Greg. He's easily one of the most irritating, domineering, and selfish individuals I've ever encountered. Since he married my mother, my life has been completely disrupted. To give some background, my parents split up 3 years ago. My mom and dad never really saw eye to eye and were constantly arguing. When they finally decided to divorce, it didn't come as a shock to me. They were never a good fit to begin with. Truthfully, they gave it their best shot, but the tension between them was always there, particularly when it came to handling household duties. Even though my mom was technically a stay-at-home parent, she didn't take to the usual responsibilities that come with that role. Tasks like cooking, cleaning, or helping me with schoolwork were never high on her list, and she was very open about how much she disliked doing them. Instead, she was obsessed with her phone, constantly trying to grow her online presence. She saw herself as a beauty influencer, always filming or posting content, even though her follower numbers were far from remarkable. When she wasn't scrolling or recording, she was out with her friends, spending a good chunk of my dad's earnings on shopping trips, brunches, and spa days. She never really matched the traditional image of what most people expect from a mother. Unlike most parents who take an active interest in their children's schoolwork, ensuring they stay on top of their studies and asking about their day-to-day experiences, my mom's focus was almost entirely on herself. She was always preoccupied with how she looked and often pressured me to maintain a slim, polished appearance at all times. It felt like she viewed me more as an extension of her own image rather than as my own person with unique needs and feelings. After the divorce, both of my parents shared custody of me, and I began splitting my time between their two homes. At first, it was challenging to adjust to living in two different places, but I was slowly getting used to it. Just as I started to find some balance, my mom introduced Greg into the picture. She was completely infatuated with him from their very first meeting. Within days, they were officially dating, and after just a few weeks, she insisted I meet him. Out of nowhere, this man I didn't know became a constant presence in our lives, and I was supposed to accept him without question. Honestly, I might have been more open to accepting Greg if he had been a reasonable and kind person, but unfortunately, that's far from the truth. From the very start, Greg had these absurd expectations. He acted as though I should immediately embrace him as a replacement for my real dad, even though, to me, he was nothing compared to my father. He's always interfering in my life, and it seems like he takes every chance he gets to put me down. No matter what I do, he finds a way to criticize or micromanage me, and it's exhausting. For example, Greg has 2 sons of his own, and he gets visibly irritated with me whenever he thinks I'm being too girly, as he puts it. He's even gone as far as telling me I shouldn't wear dresses or fitted skirts, as if my clothing choices are any of his concern. He also insists that I keep my long hair tied up in a bun at all times, refusing to let me wear it down, but his overbearing behavior doesn't end there. Whenever I have friends over, he always barges in, claiming he's just checking in. It's never a simple greeting or a quick question, though. He lingers and hovers, acting as though he doesn't trust us to be alone. It's beyond intrusive and downright embarrassing. When I try to stand up for myself and ask him to give us space, he dismisses me with comments like, "Girls need constant supervision," and tells us to act like he's not even there. What makes it worse is that he doesn't treat his sons this way or feel the need to monitor their every move. The double standard is maddening. Whenever I've tried to talk to my mom about how much Greg's behavior upsets me, hoping for some empathy or backup, she just brushes it off. She claims he's just being protective, as if that somehow justifies his overbearing actions. To make matters worse, Greg's 2 sons add another layer of frustration to my life. They have no respect for personal boundaries, and their personalities clash with mine in every way imaginable. They're also relentless bullies, constantly finding ways to tease, mock, or belittle me. Yet, instead of intervening, my mom downplays their behavior, saying things like, "That's just how siblings bond." It's exhausting and feels like no one is on my side. When my mom announced she was marrying Greg after only a year of dating, she expected me to go along with it without question. She made it very clear that she loved him and was committed to making their relationship succeed. She was aware of my reservations and the issues I had with Greg, but she didn't hesitate to tell me what she expected, to give him a fair chance, and not to complicate things for her. She pushed me to welcome him into our family as if it were the simplest thing in the world. It felt like an overwhelming demand, especially considering how quickly everything was moving, but I didn't want to let her down or cause tension, so I reluctantly agreed to try. Since then, I've honestly tried to adjust to Greg and his sons, doing my best to fit into their routines and adapt to the new dynamic, even though it's been incredibly challenging. One of the hardest parts is Greg's insistence that I call him Dad. It feels wrong every single time, and saying it only fuels my frustration. I already have a father, and I don't want to replace him, but Greg either doesn't understand how difficult this is for me or simply doesn't care. It's like my feelings don't matter in this situation, and that makes it even harder to accept. But beyond the issue of what to call Greg, what truly hurts is how my mom's priorities have shifted since her marriage. It feels like she's more invested in Greg's sons than in me. She spends more time with them, helps them with things she never bothered to do for me, and acts more like a mother to to them than she ever has with me. At times, it feels like I've been pushed aside, like I no longer have a place in her life. It's as if she's only a mom to Greg's sons now. I'd much rather live with my dad, especially since he's always been more understanding and supportive, but after landing a better paying job in another city, he had to move away. He still visits me occasionally, and we talk on the phone regularly. I've confided in him about the struggles I've had with Greg and his sons, and he's been incredibly supportive. He's even tried to talk to my mom about it, hoping to help improve the situation. But every time he brings it up, my mom shuts him down, telling him to stay out of her marriage. Over the years, I've done my best to adapt to life with this new family dynamic. I've tried to be patient and open-minded, hoping that if I put in the effort, things might eventually get better between Greg, his sons, and me. But no matter how hard I try, I still feel like I'm invisible in my own family. This year, Greg surprised us all by announcing he'd received a promotion at work. To celebrate, he decided to treat the whole family to a vacation. Everyone was thrilled, especially since it had been so long since we'd gone on a trip together. He and my mom picked the destination and made all the arrangements. But just a day before we were supposed to leave, my mom and I were in a car accident. We were driving home after shopping for vacation outfits when another car hit us from behind. It wasn't a major crash, but it was enough to leave us both shaken and injured. My mom came out of the accident with just a few scratches and bruises, but I wasn't as fortunate. I ended up with a broken arm and a concussion from the impact. An ambulance was called, and before I knew it, I was being admitted to the hospital. When Greg first heard about the accident, he rushed to the hospital, appearing genuinely concerned. For a moment, I thought he might actually care about me and my mom, that he was there to support us. But it didn't take long for his true priorities to surface. He kept bringing up the trip, obsessing over whether we'd still be able to go and worrying that the money he'd spent would go to waste. The doctors told us that because of my concussion, I'd need to stay in the hospital for a few days for observation. Travel was out of the question for me, which clearly frustrated Greg. He looked at me as if the accident were my fault, like I'd ruined his plans on purpose. My mom half-heartedly offered to stay behind with me, and for a brief moment, I felt a spark of hope that she'd choose to be there for me during such a tough time. But Greg quickly shut that down. He argued that since the plane tickets were already paid for, and we were already losing money with me not going, it didn't make sense for my mom to waste even more by staying behind. He then turned to me and said that at 15, I should be perfectly capable of staying in the hospital alone for a few days. He pointed out how safe the hospital was, with doctors and nurses available around the clock, as if that somehow made it okay to leave me by myself. He even suggested that once I was discharged, he'd arrange for a babysitter to stay with me at home. I argued with him, telling him I wasn't comfortable staying alone or having a stranger take care of me. I begged my mom to stay with me instead. My mom did try to stand up for me, telling Greg it wasn't right to leave me alone in the hospital. She knew it was wrong, but Greg pushed back, insisting that her staying would be pointless, just sitting by my side and doing nothing productive. He made it sound like her presence wouldn't matter, completely ignoring the emotional support I needed. For him, not wasting money on the trip was more important than anything else. It was clear he didn't see me as his real child, so he didn't care how I felt or what I was going through. I pleaded with them, saying that at 15, I shouldn't be left alone in the hospital. I was scared, in pain, and the thought of going through this without any family around was overwhelming. I even suggested a compromise. Maybe my mom could call my dad to come stay with me while she and Greg went on the trip. I knew my dad would come in a heartbeat if he knew I was hospitalized, but Greg immediately shot the idea down. He dismissed my concerns, saying I was overreacting to minor injuries. He brushed off the idea of calling my dad, claiming it would only worry him unnecessarily. According to Greg, there was no need to disrupt anyone else's plans over something as trivial as a concussion and a broken arm, injuries that would heal on their own with a few days of rest. In the end, Greg's pressure won out. I looked at my mom, hoping she'd stand her ground and insist on staying with me, but as usual, she gave in to Greg instead of fighting for me. She agreed to leave. She stayed with me for just one night, which gave me a little comfort. I held on to the hope that maybe, after seeing how vulnerable I was, she'd realize I needed her there. But the next day, Greg showed up at the hospital to pick her up, eager to head off on the trip as planned, without a second thought for how I was doing. After my mom left me alone at the hospital, I felt completely abandoned and betrayed. By the second day, I couldn't hold back my tears anymore. One of the nurses noticed me crying, and realizing I had no one there to support me, kindly offered to call my mom. I told her it was fine, that they probably wouldn't answer anyway, but she insisted, so I gave her my dad's number instead. I was half expecting my dad to brush it off, maybe even echo Greg's words and tell me I was overreacting. But the moment he picked up the phone and heard from the nurse about my situation, his concern was immediate. He sounded more worried than I'd heard him in years, and asked if it was true that my mom had gone on the trip without me. I explained everything, how Greg had insisted it was fine to leave me because he didn't want to waste the trip money, and how my mom had ultimately gone along with it. My dad was furious as I recounted the story. He went quiet for a moment, but I could feel his anger simmering. He then told me that my mom had only mentioned we'd been in a minor fender bender, completely downplaying the situation. She hadn't said a word about my broken arm, my concussion, or the fact that they'd left me alone in the hospital. According to her, there was nothing to worry about, so my dad hadn't felt the need to check in with me. Hearing that my mom had lied to my dad about my condition made me feel even more hurt and betrayed. My dad immediately assured me he was coming to the hospital as soon as possible. He said he'd drop everything and drive over to stay with me, no matter how long it took. For the first time since I'd been admitted, I felt a sense of relief, knowing that someone was finally taking my situation seriously. As I waited, I realized just how much I needed this kind of support. Within 2 hours, my dad arrived at the hospital, and seeing him walk through the door felt like a weight had been lifted off my chest. I broke down in tears as he hugged me and reassured me that everything would be okay. He immediately went to speak with my doctors, making sure he understood every detail of my injuries. I could see the relief on his face when he confirmed that while my injuries were painful, they weren't life-threatening. He expressed deep regret for not being there sooner and for not questioning my mom's version of events. It was clear he was beating himself up for trusting her word without checking on me directly. My dad's anger toward Greg was palpable. He was livid that Greg had treated my needs so casually and had chosen to go on a trip rather than making sure I was cared for. The lack of respect and concern Greg showed by leaving me alone in the hospital made it painfully clear how little I mattered to him. His actions spoke volume. Despite being married to my mom, I was nothing more than an inconvenience to him. My dad tried calling my mom and Greg, but neither of them answered. This only fueled his anger, and he vowed to make sure they faced consequences for abandoning me. Over the next 2 nights, my dad stayed by my side, taking time off work to ensure I wasn't alone. He didn't leave my side until I was discharged, and even then, he wasn't comfortable with me going back to Greg's house, where I'd be left with a babysitter until everyone returned. Instead, he insisted I come home with him, and I agreed without hesitation. Once I settled in at my dad's place, he tried reaching out to my mom again. This time, she answered, but her response only made things worse. She claimed she had missed his earlier calls because she was too busy enjoying herself with Greg and his sons. Hearing this only fueled my dad's anger, and he didn't hold back. He firmly told her that her behavior was unacceptable, that leaving me alone in the hospital was a serious act of neglect, and that he planned to take legal action to hold her and Greg accountable. He even mentioned the possibility of going to court to ensure she could lose custody of me, making it clear he was prepared to report both of them for their actions. Since then, my phone has been flooded with calls and texts from both Greg and my mom. Instead of acknowledging what they did or offering any kind of apology, they've been bombarding me with messages accusing me of ruining their vacation by telling my dad about my situation. Greg even went as far as to say that all I had to do was keep quiet and stay in the hospital without causing any trouble. According to them, everything would have been fine if I'd just gone along with their plans without speaking up. They're acting like I'm the one who did something wrong, as if I betrayed them by seeking support from my dad. Update 1. After reflecting on everything and talking to my dad, I've realized how many times over the years Greg and my mom have neglected me, and how I just let it happen. I stayed quiet, hoping things would get better, but they never did. It's hard to admit, but I allowed myself to be pushed aside for their convenience. Looking back now, I can't believe I put up with it for so long. For example, Greg constantly undermined my relationship with my dad. He would make negative comments about him, calling him a deadbeat or a loser compared to himself. Greg believed my dad wasn't a good husband to my mom, so he felt justified in bashing him. My mom never stepped in to stop him. Whenever I tried to talk to her about my feelings or the issues I was having at home, Greg would dismiss me, saying I was overreacting or being too sensitive because I'm a girl. He often bragged about how lucky he was to have only sons, as if that made him superior. Greg also showed blatant favoritism toward his sons in everyday situations. He would give them money for anything they wanted without question, but whenever I asked my mom for something, Greg would interrogate me, accusing me of wasting money on unnecessary things. What's worse is that the money wasn't even his, it was my dad's, and I had every right to use it as I needed. Despite living in the same house, we never spent quality time together as a family. Greg and my mom would often make plans with his sons and leave me out, claiming they didn't want to bother me or that they wanted to spend time together without me. This left me feeling excluded and unimportant. They would go out for dinner or do activities they enjoyed without ever considering that I might want to be included. This is probably why I was so excited about the vacation. It was a rare chance to feel like part of the family. Greg and my mom also never made an effort to celebrate my birthdays. They always said that since Greg's sons didn't make a big deal out of their birthdays, I shouldn't expect much either. It's like they believed I didn't deserve any special attention just because it wasn't their way. And when it came to gifts, I often received things I didn't even like or use, as if they couldn't be bothered to think about what I might actually enjoy. Whenever I struggled with school, Greg would dismiss my efforts, saying things like, "You're just lazy, that's your problem," or "Why do you even bother with that stuff?" Instead of asking what was going on or offering help, he made it about how my struggles inconvenienced him. My mom, on the other hand, would just stay silent, never offering comfort or encouragement, even though she knew how much it was affecting protecting me. Update 2. My dad ended up reporting Mom and Greg to CPS. It wasn't an easy decision for him, but he felt it was necessary to ensure that what happened to me wasn't swept under the rug. He couldn't stand by and let them treat me the way they did, leaving me alone in the hospital after a serious accident. When Greg and my mom returned from their trip, they were contacted by CPS officials. They had to answer a lot of questions about the situation, their actions, and their decision to leave me behind. I'm sure it was a wake-up call for them, though probably not the kind they were expecting. The authorities agreed with my dad that leaving me in the hospital, especially after I'd been injured, was unacceptable. They recognized that I had been neglected in a way that put my well-being at risk. Later, my mom called me. She wasn't happy, and I could tell from her tone that she was upset with me. She told me that I had caused a lot of trouble for her and Greg by involving CPS. It felt like she was blaming me for the situation, even though I knew I hadn't done anything wrong. She warned me that CPS would be reaching out to me next to get my side of the story. Then, my mom tried to pressure me into lying to the authorities. She said that if I didn't, I could end up being taken away from her, and she might lose custody of me. I argued with her, telling her I wasn't comfortable lying and that maybe she should have thought about the consequences when she left me alone at the hospital. She tried to guilt trip me, saying things like how she had given me years of her life and that I owed her loyalty. She made it sound like I was betraying her by being honest, as if I were the one at fault. What really hit me was when she told me that lying would also protect Greg and his sons. She explained that the CPS investigation could cause problems for Greg, especially with his ex-wife, who might use this against him. I couldn't believe how my mom seemed more concerned about Greg's reputation and her own than about what I had been through. Not once did she ask how I was doing or if I had recovered. Instead, she kept begging me to lie and protect her family. I couldn't take her selfishness anymore. I stood my ground and told her clearly that I wouldn't lie to the authorities. I said I would tell them exactly what had happened and I wouldn't cover up for anyone. If this meant she and Greg faced consequences, then so be it. They were the adults who had messed up, and I wasn't going to protect them from the fallout. My mom yelled at me and called me names, but I didn't back down. Since then, I felt guilty, but I know I'm doing the right thing. It's hard to stand up to someone who's supposed to care for you, but I can't keep letting them treat me like I don't matter. I deserve better, and I'm finally starting to believe that. Update 3. It's been almost 2 weeks since my last update. I've spoken to the authorities and told them the truth about what happened. For now, I'm staying with my dad, and it's been a huge relief. My dad has been looking into schools nearby so I can stay with him permanently. Living with him has been such a positive change. He's supportive, listens to me, and respects my space and decisions. It's a complete turnaround from what I was dealing with before. I feel heard and valued here, and it's made a world of difference. My mom has continued to try to guilt trip me, but there's not much else she can do at this point. CPS has given her a formal warning for neglecting her responsibilities toward me. They've made it clear that her actions were unacceptable and have required her to make significant changes like attending mandatory parenting classes and counseling to address her issues with neglect and improve her relationship with me. Greg was also scrutinized by CPS for his lack of care and respect toward me, especially during the hospital incident. They've made it clear that they'll be closely monitoring the situation if I ever go back to stay with them, and any further neglect or mistreatment will lead to more serious consequences. Update 4. It's hard to believe it's been almost 4 months since I moved in with my dad. I finally feel like I'm in a place where I'm not constantly walking on eggshells or doubting my worth. Living with my dad has been such a breath of fresh air. He's supportive, listens to me, and genuinely cares about my well-being. I can talk to him about my day, my struggles, and my dreams, and he actually engages and supports me. I've been able to focus more on school and my mental health, and I feel like I'm finally rediscovering who I am. I've also made some amazing new friends at school, and spending time with them has been so uplifting. Last month, for the first time in years, I got to have a proper birthday celebration. I invited my friends over, and we had a pizza party while watching cheesy romantic movies. It was the kind of birthday I'd always wanted but never had when I lived with my mom and Greg. As for my mom, things are still complicated. She's been trying to contact me more often lately, sending texts about how sorry she is and how much she misses me. Part of me feels guilty for staying away, but then I remember everything that led to this point. I've made it clear to her that I'm not ready to come back, and while she tries to reach out, I've set boundaries for myself. Her actions were damaging, and she needs to take full responsibility for that before I can even consider rebuilding our relationship. As for Greg, he hasn't apologized or taken any responsibility for his actions. Honestly, I'm not surprised. He's never shown any real concern for me or my well-being. The way he treated me, especially during the hospital incident, is something I'll never forget. Whether he ever changes or not doesn't matter to me anymore. I'm not waiting around to find out. I've learned to rely on myself and the people who truly care about me, and that's enough. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm on the right path, and I'm not looking back.